think of Weymouth, you automatically see a picture of a traditional family holiday with swimming in the sea, candy floss, fish and chips, and crab sandwiches. But Weymouth, like all places, has a darker side where human emotions reach a fever pitch and the results are tragic. James, over to you to describe one such tale in 1902.
This true crime story is set in Weymouth, a thriving fishing harbourside town on the south coast of Dorset, as it is today, with a population of a little over 11,000 in 1902, when these events are set. One of the residents was Edward Simmons, who had not had the best of times recently. He had been suffering from sleepless nights and periodic vomiting, and nor had his long-suffering wife, who had to put up with his incessant mumblings and rantings for the past few months. She finally managed to get him to go and see the doctor by the name of Wetherell. After the consultation with the rather flustered patient, Dr. Wetherell diagnosed alcoholic gastritis and prescribed some medication which he hoped would work. Simmons had been a sickly child and at one time had been severely ill, and his parents were warned by doctors that the illness could leave him with some mental impairment. He did quite well during his school years and went on to get a job with a firm of wholesale chemists. He seemed to take to the job and worked hard, but after a few months he convinced himself that the foreman was out to get him in some way. As his paranoia grew, his timekeeping slipped, and he started to take more and more time off work. Then one day he didn't turn up at all. He simply vanished. His parents became very concerned about his increasingly erratic behaviour, and wondered if it was the onset of the mental problems that they had been warned about years earlier. They were even more concerned that their son had not come home, and was completely missing. They reported the situation to the police, who said they would keep an eye out for Edward. Time passed, and there was still no sign of him, and he had not been in touch. Such was the concern of the parents that they placed advertisements in newspapers asking for any information as to his whereabouts. There were a few replies about possible sightings, but no real leads. One reply, though, did stand out. It was Edward, but the wording of his message seemed strange. It was as though he was talking about a completely different person, and it soon became apparent that he had no recollection of events in the recent past, or even that he had a job. However, he did reveal where he was, and was brought back safely to the family home. But this posed a question. What was to be done with him now to keep him safe in the future? Much deliberation went on in the household, and his brother John had a possible solution. The two brothers should work together as travelling salesmen, skills that Edward could easily adapt to. John was right, as his brother took to his new occupation enthusiastically, and appeared to enjoy his new direction in life. All was working well for Edward until there was an occurrence in Cardiff. He was staying at a hotel frequented by other people with his occupation. It was part of his daily routine that he would do the day's paperwork in the evening, but that day he was persuaded by his colleagues to forego this, and instead to come out for a drink in one of the local pubs. Edward was a stranger to alcohol, but was eventually persuaded to come along, as long as he did not have to partake of any booze. This, as it turned out, was not the best of decisions. Too late he discovered that the company he had fallen into were a bad lot. As the evening progressed, too late he discovered that his new friends had been spiking his drinks with alcohol. Consequently, he ended up in a pretty sorry state, so drunk that he could hardly stand up. Worse was to come. When he finally woke up the following morning, no doubt with a thumping hangover, he discovered that all his samples had been stolen, as well as all of the customers' cash that he had gathered on his journey. Even his wallet had been emptied. Not a good start to the day. He felt so ashamed at his stupidity that he was disinclined to return home. So he decided to write to his brother to apologise and explain what had happened, and beg for forgiveness. Such was the shame that he felt, Edward decided on the spot to change direction and travel to Ireland and join the army. This spur-of-the-moment decision actually worked out well for him. He successfully served in the West Kent Regiment for 8 years and ended up as a sergeant. His new occupation took him all over the world on various postings. His well-being significantly improved, and he was eventually discharged with an honourable record. He settled in Edinburgh and became the manager of a nightclub. After a period of time, he moved to Manchester in the same capacity for his employers, who were opening a new premises. It was there that he met Frances, and they married in 1895. After years of relative success in life, Edward started to show some of the symptoms that had blighted him in the past. He started to get regular migraines and was convinced that the top of his head was going to explode. Unfortunately, domestic bliss was interrupted as Frances became seriously ill and was in hospital for several months as she slowly recovered. Edward felt lost without her presence at home, and his general behaviour started to change. He went to work earlier and earlier, and instructed the staff to do likewise, something that definitely did not endear him to those around him. His mental balance was unwinding, to the extent that he was seen on several occasions sitting on the steps of the club in his pyjamas in the early hours of the morning, as if waiting for something to happen. His behaviour was noticed by his employers, but they seemed disinterested as Edward continued to work hard and was good at his job. However, somehow he felt something was amiss with his situation. An old demon from his past was about to come out of the shadows. Edward started to get more paranoid at work, believing that his employers were trying to interfere and undermine him, and worse, force him out of his job against his will. It got so bad in his mind that one day he handed in his resignation and quit, despite the management desperately trying to keep him on board. Edward was left jobless, and as a result homeless as well. When his wife Frances finally left hospital, they both moved to Aldershot and stayed with friends for a hoped-for new start. Sadly, he was not to be, but after a fraught number of weeks, Edward had a stroke of luck. The Royal Dorset Yacht Club in Weymouth, by chance, were looking for a steward-cum-manager, and after an interview, Edward was offered the position. Once again, his life looked like it was back on track. He had a way with words which had worked well for him in the past, and he used this to his advantage by getting to know some prominent members of the sailing club and making friends. Two of his new friends were the Graham brothers, who ran a wine and spirit merchants in the town. Edward would drop in to see them from time to time, and quite often had a glass of whisky with them. It was at the bar in the premises that he met one of the barmaids by the name of Hetty Stevens, who was from Cornwall and 24 years old. He soon became besotted with her, something that Hetty found quite annoying, as she had no interest in Edward and his unwanted flirtations, especially as she already had a boyfriend. Her admirer continued with his attention, and one day brought her a present of a gold bracelet, even impressing on her the expense of it in order to make more of an impression. She politely accepted the gift, but continued to try and keep a respectful distance. The next few weeks would be defining for Edward, as his mental state started to spiral into a steady decline. He continued to pursue Hetty for her affections, and started to become frustrated that his advances were not reciprocated. Back at the yacht club, he started to become obsessed with the view that some of the post was somehow going missing. Although the intended recipient of the letters made no mention of the fact, Edward felt obliged to report the matter to the police. They looked into it, but came to the conclusion that it was a delusion on the part of Edward. Over the following weeks, some of the friends he had initially made starting to shun him due to his sometimes erratic behaviour and some of the plainly untrue things that he would say. The smallest of things could cause him nervous anxiety, and anything that he perceived to be out of his normal routine would cause him to become overstressed. Francis became frustrated by his inconsistencies and delusions every day and went to see Dr. Wetherall, who promised to look into it and do whatever he could to help the increasingly distressed Edward. But things were about to take a distressing turn. Edward went to see his friend Percy Graham for a quiet private chat. The gist of the conversation was that Edward had witnessed Hetty on several occasions pocket cash from the till whilst working behind the bar, as well as being drunk on several occasions during her working day. Graham was taken aback and made the point that he did not believe them, as his employee was a valued and trusted member of staff, and that Edward should leave the premises and not to repeat these ridiculous allegations to anybody else. A disgruntled Edward left, his mind in a turmoil. On his way back to the yacht club, he visited an ironmonger's, where he purchased a long-bladed knife, saying that it was needed for the preparation of fish. A reasonable statement on the face of it. Edward's unpredictable behaviour continued as he hailed a taxi and asked to be taken to the railway station, where he was dropped off. Strangely, shortly after, Edward was seen walking back through the town. Even more strange was the taxi driver discovered a brand new knife on the floor in the back of his cab. Continuing his walk back through Weymouth, Edward visited a gun shop where he carefully perused a selection of handguns. He carefully chose a service-style revolver, which he purchased along with some ammunition. He also bought a long-bladed knife, presumably to replace the one that he'd left in the taxi. Edward's mental decline continued over the following days, with unpredictable and bizarre behaviour. For example, over-repetitive actions such as constantly counting and recounting teaspoons over and over and over again. What once may have seemed amusing to onlookers now made them wary, and people began to keep a distance from the obviously impaired Edward. His obsession with Hetty continued, as did his fixation with the deluded fact that she had been stealing from her workplace. He repeated his allegations to anyone who would listen, but there were few people who by now could put up with him. Percy Graham even went so far as to speak to Frances Simmons to ask her to speak to her husband to stop him making unwarranted allegations about his innocent member of staff. Archie Graham, Percy's brother, saw Edward in the bar one day and had a firm chat with him, insisting that he stop these allegations and leave the woman alone. It seems that Edward took this conversation on board, as he agreed to desist and leave Hetty alone. His fragility increased more day by day, and the slightest action or conversation could set him off. He was becoming irrational and made no bones about pointing out what he perceived as other people's shortcomings, and he would scream like a madman, which he was certainly becoming. The intense headaches were also becoming more frequent. Things were coming to an uncertain climax. When Edward arrived and saw Hetty still working behind the busy bar, he became irritated and angrily went over to her, and after ordering a glass of whisky, started to argue with her. Hetty, according to witness accounts, was clearly upset and started to argue back. Her relief member of staff arrived at about 6:15, by which time the argument seemed to have calmed down, although she was heard to say that she did not want anything else to do with Edward, and he should leave her alone. As Hetty walked off out of the room to go on her break, 3 shots went off, and she dropped like a stone to the floor, mortally wounded. The customers ducked for cover at this horrendous turn of events. But there was more to come, as Edward calmly put the barrel of the pistol into his mouth and discharged the weapon. He too crumpled to the floor, and then sat up. The bullet had gone through his cheek and not into the presumed intended target. One courageous customer grabbed the gun out of the way, and the police and a doctor were called. He was arrested and taken to the police station, where he was treated for his injury, as it happens, by Dr. Wetherall. After a couple of days, when he had recovered enough to speak, he gave a full account of his actions, admitting his wrongdoing. He was charged with the murder of Hetty Stevens and remanded for trial at Dorchester Assizes. When the proceedings commenced a few months later in June, it soon became clear that the accused was in no fit state to stand trial. Informed medical opinion gave the conclusion that he was certifiably insane. Even so, 2 days of evidence and witness statements were given. On the third day, the jury was sent out to deliberate all that they had heard. Their verdict was a unanimous guilty, which came with a stipulation that Simmons could not be fully responsible due to his obvious mental impairment and insanity at the time of the murder. The judge therefore made the decision that he be committed to a secure asylum and held indefinitely at His Majesty's pleasure. He was never released back into the community. Now, John, this case seems to stem from a severe childhood illness that ricocheted from time to time during Simmons' life, which culminated with a heinous crime. What comments do you have?
There is an old saying that he whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. Edward Simmons was not some horrendous recidivist who is the continued despair of his family, or some domestic brute that traumatizes his long-suffering wife. For most of the time, he seemed to act in a rational manner, interspersed with bouts of migraine. Would the family have been aware of his bouts of paranoia at work? He did go missing, but many people just vanish and eventually return home. Even today, no member of any family wants to commit a member to a mental institution unless absolutely necessary. In 1902, society had moved on from Bedlam, but lunatic asylums, as they were called, were pretty grim places. How about his time in the army? He rose from a lowly private to sergeant, for which he should be commended, and lasted 8 years in the forces. Would the tragic events have happened if he had remained in the army? Maybe, maybe not. Some people just need discipline and regimentation to overcome weaknesses in their character. Psychology was in its infancy in those days. In the First World War, soldiers were being executed for shell shock instead of being treated for their trauma. In the end, the family was powerless. This was not a lot they could do, given the circumstances. Society has thankfully now moved forward from those times.